Hello, everyone. The sad, odd, and occasionally downright dangerous life of a man whose job it was to make everyone else laugh is where we start tonight. The court jester of the Middle Ages, the jokes, the bells, the floppy cap. Before you realize that you were just one bad joke away from the dungeon, everything seems like fun and games. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. And before you settle in, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually love what I do here. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let us ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. Are you interested in becoming a court jester? Unfortunately, everyone wants to avoid being a jester. There is no training for it. Like the plague or being born left-handed in a world of swords, it's something that happens to you. The majority of jesters didn't begin by imagining themselves juggling turnips in front of irritable nobles. They were frequently picked because of something special about them rather than their drive or CV. You may have had a high-pitched voice, a hunchback, or a limp. Perhaps you were exceptionally small, unusually strange, or unusually clever. In any case, a significant figure pointed and remarked, "That one? He's witty. Let's hold on to him. Well done. They've conscripted your personality." Occasionally, it began with a single joke. At a feast, you once, most likely by accident, made a noble chuckle. You either got caught in the mud or made fun of a rival baron loud enough to be heard. You're not back in your peasant home the following morning. A new job description and a headgear with bells are being presented to you at the castle. Be amusing indefinitely. You were bought at other times. Purchased, indeed. Similar to how they may collect rare animals or enormous goblets, lords occasionally gathered jesters. You might be given gifts from one court to another, like a sarcastic party favor, if you were particularly funny or strange-looking. It's not that you applied to be a jester. You were picked without warning, just like a chicken is picked for the stew pot, and your life was no longer your own after that. You were called in for difficult political meetings, pulled out at feasts, paraded like a mascot when foreign officials called, and the official source of laughter. You were unable to refuse. You were unable to leave. Not unless you wanted to go back to the farm, or worse, get caught in the stocks after being mistaken for a vagabond, because a guy without a work, land, or purpose was merely begging to be jailed for being alive in the medieval world. Therefore, you are an entertainer in theory. In actuality, though, you're a full-time, low-paid, high-pressure joke machine employed by individuals who can fire you for poor timing. And the audition went exactly like that. You might not have a spotlight on stage, but don't let that fool you. In the medieval court, you are constantly on stage. It's not a profession you clock into to be a jester. It's your life. Although you live, dine, and breathe with nobility, you are never truly one of them. You provide them with amusement, interest, a live-in hypothetical situation, and the peculiar emotional support of the court. It is forbidden for you to be invisible. As soon as they see you, everyone expects something, a twirl, a jest, or a shrewd jab at someone else. You are essentially the most worn-out novelty act in the world, and you are always only a grin away from being labeled uninteresting. You're being monitored, even if you're not formally called upon to perform. Traversing the huge hall. Improve your strut. At dinner, passing the Queen's table. Ironically, it's better to wink or curtsy. 5 seconds of solitude in the corner. Why isn't the fool being foolish? Someone will ask. And don't ever display a genuine human emotion. Sadness. People are uncomfortable with that. Anger. Risky. Silent contemplation. Untrustworthy. They think you are preparing treason if you're not half dancing on one foot and smiling like a fool. And guess who gets called in to fix it? If someone important, is bored or agitated. You. If a hunting group led by a nobleman fails, if the cellar of wine ran out of wine, if the king's favorite dog had an unusual cough, at midnight someone will knock on your door and do something funny it is forbidden for you to be. All you can do is amuse. This means that you lose sight of who you were before the bells, jokes, and fake grins, and the distinction between your real self and your persona becomes so hazy. You are the costume in the medieval court. You don't merely wear it. The show never ends, I assure you. It seems like fun to be a jester until you realize you have to be funny all the time. You're not allowed to be off. There are no peaceful days for you. You are not allowed to feel emotions. No matter what else is happening in the world, your whole identity is supposed to be one continuous laugh track. Or your own existence. Your job description? On demand, be funny. Even though his third wife was just buried by the Duke. Even when the kingdom is engaged in combat. Even if you woke up feeling depressed and with a toothache. Not important. You're still supposed to be able to gracefully fall flat on your face, juggle, or make puns. No pressure, isn't it? Don't even consider recycling jokes. After all, these are nobility. They're looking for new amusement. You spent a week working on your clever poem? Fantastic. Before lunch, complete another 12. Additionally, pretend to be 3 courtiers while you're at it. Pretend to trip over a goose while writing a parody of the bishop's sermon. Right now. Additionally, if you bomb, you risk more than just a negative Yelp review. You risk being ridiculed, smacked, potentially thrown chicken bones, or worse, replaced. HR departments did not exist in medieval courts. Your next job could be digging your own grave or cleaning chamber pots if you can't make the wrong person laugh on the wrong day. Additionally, keep in mind that you are the only person in the room who is not permitted to be serious. The rest of us are free to weep, rage, pray, plot, or collapse. You manage to cope with the stress. Through regal outbursts, you chuckle. Wearing a silly hat and wearing a fake smile, you dance around political intrigue. I'm not feeling it today, but you can't say that. Emotions don't matter. How many laughs you can get from those who believe harshness is wit and sarcasm is foreplay determines your total worth. Therefore, in theory, it sounds fantastic to be the humorous one. However, it's less stand-up comedy and more medieval emotional hostage-taking when your safety rests on your ability to amuse people who may legally execute you for a poor joke. The line between unpleasant and humorous is extremely thin in a medieval court, and you're supposed to walk carefully across it while wearing a blindfold and balancing insults. It's your responsibility as a jester to make fun of, taunt, and remark on everything. Visitors, clergy, kings and queens, but never at the wrong time, never too directly and never too severely. You're no longer the funny guy after one poorly timed joke about the king's protruding belly or the Lord was fourth marriage. The idiot who went too far is you. The actual kicker is right here. The line shifts when you make fun of her cousin's gambling habits on Monday. The Queen chuckles. He's in the room on Tuesday, and now it's treason. On Wednesday, the King appears unhappy as she laughs once more, but too loudly. You are being hauled out by guards on Thursday for upsetting the decorum of the court. No safe zone exists, not at all. Political jokes? Dangerous? Faith? Are you suicidal? Physical attributes? Extremely risky? Royal blunders? Not at all. Unless you use a juggling routine and 3 layers of metaphor, perhaps even then don't. By using absurdity to wrap social criticism in riddles, double meanings, and animal metaphors, some jesters created an art of truth. You hope the king laughs rather than ordering your execution, and remark that the rooster with the sharp tongue and no eggs might want to crow less in the morning. It's a risk, though, always. That's your neck. if the noble you make fun of is feeling grumpy. It is blasphemous if the bishop believes your joke suggests he is avaricious. The same individuals who used to shout with amusement will suddenly clutch their pearls and act as though they never considered you funny if the court turns against you. And don't count on anyone to stand up for you. There is no protection for the jester. You're not a priest. You're not a noble person. A single look can revoke your permission to talk, and you are a fool with one. A few jesters received whippings. A few were exiled. A few were hanged. Others were retired, which literally translated to buried without a funeral in medieval times. Yes, your weapon was comedy. It was your noose, though, and timing was crucial in court. Skip the beat. Go crazy. The room is already giggling at your attire before you even say a word. Your clothing isn't designed for dignity if you're a medieval jester. Its purpose is to degrade. Your whole ensemble shouts one message as soon as you enter the courtroom. I'm not human. I am a joke. Now let's talk about the hat, the well-known coxcomb. The creature was multicolored, flopping-horned, and had bells on the tips. Ring bells. People want to hear you approaching like a walking wind chime of poor self-worth, not because it improves your performance. Your tunic. No sensible tailor would intentionally mix such a checkerboard of conflicting hues, blue and yellow, green and red. Someone who despises your dignity has stitched together bright, gaudy patches like a tapestry. Your footwear, bells and curled-toe slippers, ideal for tripping over your own relevance or slipping on spilled mead. The objective, to be honest, is that they make you appear like a goblin who has been approved by the court. Even your belt, which is frequently too big or knotted to be useful, is a joke. Do you need to carry a bag or knife? Ignore it. You're not here to do that. In a glorified mascot suit, you're here to jiggle, dance, and fall flat on your face. Furthermore, your clothing is constructed from the cheapest leftovers of linen and wool, but nobles dress in velvet, silk, fur, and gold thread embroidery. Perfect if it's heavy, scratchy, or discolored. It looks better the worse it feels. Always keep in mind that you are beneath the audience. Now picture yourself wearing this to every royal negotiation, wedding, and feast. No formal jester attire, no clothing change, and no variance. You are constantly visually absurd. You appear like a coloring book erupted on your body, even while you're being completely serious. Don't expect praises. Nice hat is not what people say. Try not to trip over your bells today, idiot, they say. Even worse, they pull your sleeve only to listen to you jingle like a desolate holiday ornament. Therefore, while your attire may be iconic, it also serves as a uniform of shame. A reminder that your attire must be sufficiently unimpressive to convince the powerful that you are never a real threat, even if your remarks are incisive. It's just a hilarious hat echo. You share a roof with monarchs, barons, and dukes, but you're not one of them, don't get me wrong. Like a noisy tapestry, you are a piece of the furniture. Located behind the kitchens or next to the servants' quarters, your room, if you're fortunate enough to get one, is a glorified storage closet. A place that's close enough to be pulled out at any time for an uncomfortable wedding toast or midnight joke, but far enough to remind you that you're not important. You don't sit with the nobility at meals. You're close enough to them to hear rumors, get insulted in the middle of a sentence, or have a piece of chicken thrown at your head in jest. You may be permitted to share the same dishes, but you will always come last, behind the priests, the aristocrats, the dog, and sometimes the stable boy. You hear everything, though, plots, affairs, and whispered insult. The reality of treaties and weddings. Because you are too insignificant in their eyes, you are the unwelcome ear in the room, and the one that no one stops talking about. One world is too high for you, while the other is too low. Although your presence is accepted, it is not valued. You can enter places that peasants don't see, but only if you're funny. Instead of being welcomed like a visitor, You're treated like a performing animal and given pats on the head. You're reminded right away if you ask for anything genuine, like a favor, protection, or respect, or if you speak too simply. Fool, know your position. You are literally an outsider living there. No matter how much you imitate the court, make fun of the lords and amuse the women, you will never be able to inherit land, marry into aristocracy, or wear a sword for honor. Your bells and your future are set in stone. You do, in fact, live with the nobility. However, you coexist with them in the same manner as a shadow does with light. Always there, but never really apparent. You've been practicing for years, creating satire that could compete with Cicero's, juggling knives, reading clever rhyme, playing instruments, and imitating voices. However, you are not considered talented by anyone. They consider you funny. The curse of being a jester is that your intellect is always considered like a party trick, regardless of your level of talent, inventiveness, or performance mastery. You write witty rhymes in several different languages. Do the funny face again, they will say with a laugh. You create a scathing political satire piece that passes as a sheep joke. Someone advises you not to get too smart and tosses a grape at your head. Though you are never recognized as such, you are expected to be brilliant. Everyone cheers when a noble performs a song. The room falls hushed when you sing better. A baron is commended for his audacity if he cracks a joke. It's considered cheeky or disrespectful if you tell the same joke more effectively. And if you truly outshine someone significant, then woe be to you. Being upstaged, especially by someone dressed like a Christmas ornament, is something that nobility dislike. You should be dazzling, not eclipsed. Thus you engage in an odd game. Don't perform so well that you make others feel inferior, but just enough to keep your job. Be clever, but not smart. Be sharp, but not frightening. Immediately juggle something to remind everyone that you're not that smart after being fantastic. It's a balancing act on the edge of a sword. This is where the true tragedy lies. A lot of jesters were very talented, because genius in a fool's mouth is only accepted if it comes with a pratfall and a jingle. Musicians, acrobats, poets, and political philosophers are all hiding beneath a mask of stupidity. What could be worse? When you make a mistake, they laugh the most. Did you miss a joke? Fall in the middle of a dance? Let go of a lute? They roar at that point. Failure confirms what they want to think, that you are just a loud-mouthed fool who is not smart enough to make fun of them in their own language, not because you intended to. You may have the most polished talent in the room, but what about your applause? It is always veiled in condescension. In a medieval court, feasts are lavish affairs with gleaming roasts, brimming wine goblets, and minstrels scuttling in the background. It's an excess festival. How about you? The primary dish of humiliation is you. Nobility are watching you like a toy they can prod for giggles as soon as guests arrive. Fool, pull a prank, make a joke, imitate Lord Wensley and his lazy eye. Not because you want to, but because the mood of 100 strong inebriated aristocrats rests on your capacity to remain composed in the face of public taunting, grabbing, slapping, and mocking. The table is not where you sit. Like a dazzling, jingly satellite of guilt, you circle it. Like a courtly Roomba, you flip between groups using a well-chosen quip or a poorly timed handstand to break awkward silences. You're never invited, but you're always available. And things take a turn when the wine begins to pour heavily. All of a sudden, your performance turns into a game for other people. Your hat is pulled down over your eyes by someone. Another requests an impression of a pig. When you flinch, someone else laughs and throws a leg bone at you. Because this is the problem, you are more than just amusement. You are a social target. The elite's safety valve. Nobles can make fun of you, but they can't make fun of each other. They do too, constantly. They make fun of your appearance, your voice, your upbringing, and your value. You're handy, Not because they despise you, because everyone feels safer, smarter, and wealthier after laughing at the jester. You're the humor that keeps the system in balance. You grin, you accept it. Since silence is the alternative, you continue to chuckle. Silence was very hazardous in the medieval court. Tension is implied by silence. Silence indicates a change in focus. Additionally, you do want to be perceived as unfunny if the spotlight is directed at someone more significant than you. You attend every feast, then. However, you are not honored. You're engrossed. Similar to the wine and bread, by the time the goblets are cleaned, they have been consumed and forgotten. Although the crown may find your tumble act amusing, they are aware that your slapstick isn't what makes you truly valuable. You have it in your ears. You see, there's a peculiar benefit to being an idiot. In plain sight, you are invisible. In your presence, nobles talk freely. Your presence is forgotten by servants. As you pour their wine, guests share their frustrations. Like furniture with feet, you go from corner to corner, catching everything. Confessions that weren't supposed to be heard are heard. Cousins murmured of treason. In the shadow of the feast, alliances were formed, bribes were offered, and affairs were confessed over goblets. You also recall everything. It keeps you alive, not because you are nosy, because occasionally you are called aside by the monarch. "Stupid," he replies. "Tell me what the French envoy heard from the bishop last night." And you had better know the solution. He might assume you're loyal to someone else if you don't. He may ask for more if you do. The awful dance is this one. The monarch wants you to tell the truth, but not in a way that would put him at fault. Your honesty is praised by the king you serve until it causes offense. It is expected of you to report in a discreet, astute manner, possibly even using riddles. Who's planning a small-scale insurrection over stew, or who's having an affair with whose wife? Disguised as the least dangerous individual in the room. You are the most dangerous informant in the court. There's a catch, though. The others are aware of it. Despite their smiles, the lords and ladies don't believe you. When you pass by, the servants stop talking. You are regarded by the guards as though you were carrying a dagger behind your back. You are, in a sense. Information is your weapon. Furthermore, in a medieval court, information is only a sarcastic jest away from being lethal. You listen all the time then, constantly choose which facts to reveal and which to hide behind a light-hearted joke, because the most deadly blade in a world full of secrets and weapons isn't made of steel. It's hidden under an idiot's smile. Despite your own turmoil, it's your responsibility to keep the other people laughing in the medieval court. Did your dog pass away? Not important. You are still expected to joke about her cousin's wig by the Queen. You have a fever. Unfortunately. The Duke needs a good laugh before he throws his plate because he had a rough hunting day. Is your heart broken? Fool, keep dancing. It's a wedding. You are not permitted to experience anything other than amusing emotions. Sadness, that is self-centered fury, insubordination, weary, being lazy. It is regarded as a betrayal if it is not joyous absurdity. People become uneasy when you display genuine emotion. It's because you're not performing your job well, not because they care. They don't believe that you are a human being with wounds and a soul. They joke that you are court furniture. You're supposed to take in everyone else's emotions while avoiding reflecting your own. You have to endure inebriated outbursts, derisive laughter, passive-aggressive taunts, and the occasional flying chicken leg while maintaining a grin. You can perform while grieving at times. You can perform when you're sick. There are times when you perform while silently pleading with the cosmos to simply let you to vanish behind a curtain and weep for 5 precious minutes. There's no curtain, though, no privacy. Vulnerability doesn't match your costume, and you're constantly on. the cruelest twist comes next. Nobles don't inquire as to why you're depressed when they do notice. "Why aren't you being funny today?" they ask. Or worse, perhaps the idiot has finally lost it. "Should we look for another one?" What do you do then? You make performance out of your misery. You turn your heartache into a joke. They can't laugh as loudly as you can. You erect a stronghold of wit around your tiredness and keep others out, because the illusion breaks the instant they discover the fool is human. Your job does too. You did have feelings then, as everyone anticipated. You have learned to cover them beneath jokes and bells, because the fool is the one who acts as though nothing hurts in court when everyone else gets to feel things. Emotional stability was not a hallmark of medieval monarchs. One ruined roast, one terrible dream, or a foreign diplomat's ill-timed sneeze, and the entire atmosphere of the court changes like a crown-wielding thundercloud. And you know who everyone looks to when the king frowns into his glass or furrows his brow? You. Because it is obvious that the idiot is not performing his duties if the king or queen is not grinning. It doesn't matter that you performed at a feast late at night, that you have a raspy voice from singing, or that you cracked 12 jokes this morning that caused 3 knights and a cook to laugh out loud. The court treats you as if you personally destroyed breakfast if the king wakes up agitated. You serve as the court's emotional insurance policy in addition to being the jester. Was a trade negotiation unsuccessful? Maybe the idiot didn't diffuse the situation enough, the king's counsellors murmur. Was the queen frowning at mass? It's possible that the jester's joke was offensive. Was it a chamber pot that caused the monarch to trip and fall? Has the idiot been skulking around once more? Sometimes it's subtle, like a sarcastic remark or a gaze of disapproval. Sometimes it's straightforward. "Fool, amuse me. You have your head in the balance and I'm in a terrible mood." They're not joking either. You could be relegated to stable cleaning or worse, put to death for being unfunny for just one poorly placed quiet. And it becomes your burden even if it wasn't your fault. To keep everyone from noticing that the king just broke a goblet over the steward's head, you need to lighten the mood, ease the tension, and make the royal toddler giggle. You turn into a human emotional thermostat, constantly modifying yourself to keep everyone else happy and warm. The problem is that nobody ever expresses gratitude to you. The king's powerful wine is the reason for any improvement in his mood. If he's laughing, it's not you who told him the joke before. You're to blame if he doesn't laugh. You lose in either case. Therefore, it is true that you, the jester, are both inconsequential and in charge of the mood of the most powerful man in the kingdom in a court of politics and paranoia. You'd better start praying if he doesn't laugh. You might share laughs with kings, wear bells on your cap, and reside in the castle. Don't be misled, though. You are not free. You're actually more imprisoned than most people, because being a medieval court jester is an identity that absorbs you, not simply a profession. That's it once you're called the idiot. There isn't a professional move or promotion. I want to try something else instead. Whether you like it or not, you're a performer for life. It makes no difference if you're old, exhausted, or ill. You're not allowed to retire. No cozy home at the border of the kingdom awaits you, and there is no pension. You don't become a revered elder, a monk, or a trader. Whatever your name was, you are not a master. Even though you're slower, sadder, and have less teeth, you're still the idiot. So what's the worst? No one will ever look past your hat, no matter how smart you are. In private, you may be more knowledgeable about statecraft than the royal council, create poetry, and speak 4 languages. Everyone, however, hears bells and anticipates pratfalls when you talk. War warnings could go unheeded. They will, however, giggle for hours if you trip over a turnip. You've turned into a talking costume. An attempt to depart? I wish you luck. You don't have any trade training, you don't own any land, Outside the castle walls, you have no contacts. You're not viewed as the witty court performer if you stroll into a community. You're just a weird, ill-dressed man who is likely mistaken for a vagrant or a maniac because of the way you talk about dukes and drama. And if you do depart and manage to make it out alive, then what? Meals will be missed. People will forget you. He made us laugh, and eventually a lower noble would say, "Bring back the old fool." In an instant you're pulled back in, for you are not a guy. People think of you as an item when they're bored. Thus, you remain. You act. The alternative is terrifying, so you laugh at your own suffering. Because you remain a fool after you've been one, forever. The peculiar thing about being a fool is this. Speaking the truth could be the only thing you are permitted to do in a room full of knights, bishops, and lords. In court, everyone else uses riddles to communicate. Diplomats are flattering, courtiers plot. To stay alive, servants tell lies. However, you possess a peculiar and perilous privilege. What others cannot express, you can. You can make fun of a policy that the monarch won't change. Jokes that expose corruption can be whispered. You can pretend to be the duchess who has an uncanny friendship with the bishop's nephew, or the baron who is obviously stealing grain. Everyone understands that you are the only honest voice in the room. They are frightened by that. Some people will silently admire you. People will publicly despise you, but everyone will be watching whatever you say. Because by morning, you can be rolling your head across the tiles because of one slip-up, one sarcastic joke, or one reality that was too near. The jester served as the court's unprotected truth serum in a society where uttering the wrong thing could land anyone in jail. You are the court's conscience in bells, its moral mirror. As long as you backflip and use a goofy voice, you are permitted to gesture at the nude emperor. However, jesters have been silenced before if your truth is too painful or if the monarch is in an especially brittle state. Therefore, it is your responsibility to shine a flickering lantern into the darkness and act as though it is a spotlight gag in a court that is based on secrets. Because sometimes the man that everyone doesn't take seriously is the only one with the courage to tell the truth. You are surrounded by people all your life, including ladies, guests, knights, and nobility. You provide entertainment at funerals, weddings, coronations, and feasts. The enormous halls reverberate with your voice. Chambers are filled with laughter from your jokes. However, nobody is there when it's your turn. While the jester's existence is noisy, his death is typically quiet. Unnoticed and unmourned, you pass away in a corner room. No eulogy, no procession, no marble slab engraved with your most witty remark. You are not remembered in the same way as a poet or knight. Songs and family history don't contain references to you. You're simply gone. Perhaps years later, the cook brings you up once. That idiot who used to dance like a goat, do you remember? Perhaps a new jester discovers your old bells in a drawer without asking who gave them to them. Someone else took your place before your bed even grew cold, so perhaps no one remembers you at all because you weren't truly a person to them. The very thing that made you valuable, your capacity to vanish behind a joke, is also what guarantees that you will be forgotten. You were a sound, a color, a flash of laughter, interchangeable and disposable. You never get married, have children, own property, or establish a reputation. You leave no legacy of your own, but you give others a sense of importance. No one will come to your tomb, not even your best friend in court, the steward who used to make fun of you for imitating the bishop. Fools were not deemed holy enough for consecrated ground, thus you might be buried outside the churchyard. Not enough prayers, too many jokes. You measured your value in their happiness and lived for their laughter. However, laughing is short-lived. It reverberates once before fading, and after you go, the halls become silent until the next idiot shows up, fumbling for applause. Yes, your life made other people happy. You caused rulers to swallow their pride and kings to forget their troubles. However, there is only stillness when your candle eventually goes out. No ceremony, no audience. And perhaps, just possibly, the faint ringing of bells that nobody remembers. The jester provided amusement for the medieval court's lords and women. Comic relief in a world of formality, politics and conflict. The jester wasn't merely there to entertain, though, as you will see if you look more closely. His purpose was to remind he was a contradiction in disguise, low-born but permitted to make fun of rulers, speaking truth to power despite being powerless, laughed at but feared. He was to be studied, not applauded, as he stood in the middle of the feast, jingling and whirling. Since a mirror was the jester. No one else ventured to speak what he disclosed in his jokes. His political message was hidden in his puns. His hypocrisy was exposed by his mimicry. Additionally, he made the room squirm each time he made it laugh, because there was always a glimmer of truth in the slapstick. Until he wasn't, it was safe to laugh at the idiot, until he made too many points. This man in bells and rags knows us better than we'd like, until the room realized. He thereby transcended his role as a performer. He turned into a representation, a reminder of the brittleness of power. Even when disguised as humor, that truth can be harmful. A weapon that can pierce deeper than any sword is that laughter. The jester was the outlier in a society that was fixated on hierarchy and order. And that's why he was so important. He strolled the halls of power because he reminded the powerful of their greatest fear, not because he was revered, being human, being foolish, and being vulnerable. However, the nobles were never really the target of the joke. He was responsible. For the short-lived acceptance of those who would never consider him an equal, he gave up his independence, legacy, dignity, and peace of mind. His greatness was buried beneath ridiculousness, wordplay encasing his knowledge, his truth written off as folly. And yet, centuries later, we still remember him, not as a clown, but as something more nuanced, eerie, and authentic. The jester in the Middle Ages was serious. He was a cautionary tale. That sometimes the only one telling the truth is the one you're busy laughing at. Ancient theatre began amid a whirl of booze, masks, and divine turmoil long before curtains raised and players bowed. Applause and playwrights weren't the beginning. Dionysus, the Greek deity of fertility, wine, ceremonial madness, and performance. Theatre was more than merely culture at Athens in the 6th century BCE. It was a cult, the city's Dionysia, a spring celebration honoring the god himself, is when the first dramas appeared. People poured into the city to celebrate. They sacrificed livestock. Rivers of wine flowed, and a miracle occurred amid all of this celebration. People began to behave, becoming, not pretending, chanting choruses that conflated prayer and performance, dancing in wild circles, and adopting voices that were not their own. The focal point? A chorus of as many as 50 guys moving in time, masks on their faces, eyes burning with joy, performs a dithyramb, a wild hymn-like chant. These weren't your typical actors. Each voice was a drop in the heavenly pool of Dionysian energy, and they were vessels and conduits. A man by the name of Thespis then appeared. According to legend, Thespis left the chorus around 534 BCE and spoke as a character instead of a collective. The idea of an actor appeared out of thin air. For this reason, we still refer to performers as thespians. Think about it. On stage, a lone man pretending to be someone else. It must have seemed like magic or sacrilege. The Greeks were captivated. What started off as a holy rite began to transform into a planned show. It would soon be further refined by playwrights such as Aeschylus and Sophocles, who added a second and third actor, as well as dialogue, narrative, and the concept of dramatic struggle. However, the spiritual centre remained. Large outdoor theatres carved into hillsides hosted these early plays. The most well-known of them was the Theatre of Dionysus in Athens. Up to 17,000 people might fit inside, forming a semicircle to watch something that walked the line between civic obligation, art, and religion. Therefore, no, the theatre did not begin in quiet. It came masked, loud, wine-soaked, and God-fueled. The stage served as a gateway to myth, insanity, and significance, rather than merely being a place for pretend play. The yearning to celebrate something greater than ourselves was the beginning of it all. Greetings from the stage. Greek theatre evolved beyond just devotion to God. It turned into a mirror that allowed Athenians to see their own anxieties, shortcomings, and transient splendors mirrored in the Mediterranean sun. However, tragedy and masks are two topics we must discuss if we are to fully comprehend that mirror. The word tragedy, or tragoideia, which means goat song, is still used in contemporary narrative, although its roots are murky and peculiar. It could be a reference to the goats offered as sacrifices to Dionysus, or the goat that is given as a reward to the top performance. In any case, tragedy had solidified into a formal art by the 5th century BCE. The plays were largely lethal, poetic, and well-structured. Consider fate, treachery, retaliation, arrogance, and gods that played with mortals in the same way that cats play with mice. And at the center of it all were masks. Greek actors changed, not merely acted out parts. Each actor, usually a man, may wear different masks to represent several personas. A wide-eyed face of dread, a twisted mouth for sadness, a delicate, feminine mask for queens and gods. These masks weren't subtle. Even the poorest seat at the top of the amphitheater could sense the character's mood because they were stylized, large, and frequently exaggerated. The actor's voice was crucial behind the mask. Naturalism was less important than projection and clarity. Actors had to use their breath, tone, and exact physicality to command a sea of thousands of people without the use of microphones or lighting. All of this could be happening under the open sky, with one actor kneeling in sorrow and another howling into the sky. Tragedians like as Euripides, Sophocles, and Aeschylus transformed the genre. Sophocles contributed a third actor, Aeschylus added a second, and Euripides supplied raw passion and psychological depth that caused his characters to bleed on the page. They addressed issues of human reason's boundaries, war trauma, and divine injustice. Medea, Antigone, and Oedipus. They were more than plays, they served as battlefields for philosophy. Nevertheless, Greek theatre was not a funeral in spite of all this gloom. It was a public event. Like the Olympic Games for the soul, tragedies were performed in a competitive manner. Everyone in the city, even the impoverished, would go. The project was even funded by wealthy folks as a kind of public service. The mask had evolved into a tool of disclosure, and the theatre had become a hallowed space. The Greeks had managed to create art by gazing into chaos. Greek comedy pulled down its tunic and mooned the universe as tragedy struggled with gods and doom. Comedy became its rebellious younger sibling as Athens developed into a cultural and intellectual powerhouse by the late 5th century BCE. It was loud, unrefined, and disrespectful. A theatrical playground where everyone was subject to mockery, including the gods. What would suffering mean if tragedy asked, "Why is Zeus such a haughty fool?" comedy asked. Aristophanes, the Shakespeare of satirist, was the master of this craft. Lysistrata, the clouds and the frogs, were among his clever, obscene, and scathing comedies. For instance, Lysistrata describes women who refuse to have sex in order to make their men cease fighting. It was political, humorous, and revolutionary. Imagine being to a play where the characters are openly laughing while ridiculing your government, your neighbors, and your own terrible habits. Often performed immediately following the tragic trilogies, comedy plays continued to be an element of religious festivals, such as the City Dionysia. As a chorus of dancing sausages ridiculed dishonest politicians, the audience would alternate between sobbing over Antigone and bursting with laughs. The exaggeration of masks in comedy was even greater than in tragedy. Even from the back row, grotesque faces with snub noses, protruding eyes, and massive, well-male appendages are sure to make people chuckle. Wigs were wild, costumes were padded, and, depending on the humor, the chorus may appear like birds, bees, frogs, or clouds. Greek humor, however, was profoundly political, and not just slapstick. Aristophanes used surgical accuracy to attack philosophers, playwrights, and bellicose individuals. According to some academics, the cloud mockery of Socrates was so vicious that it fueled the popular suspicion that ultimately resulted in his imprisonment. Comedy changed as the classical era became older. In the 4th century BCE, new comedy tempered sarcasm and concentrated on home stories, identity theft, love affairs, and cunning slaves outwitting unsophisticated masters. Menander and other playwrights established the foundation for later Roman comedies and even contemporary sitcoms. Greek humor was disguised truth-telling, not just amusement. Masks and music, dance and defiance, riddles and punchlines, a democratic city talking to itself. What is fate? Where tragedy asked. Comedy retorted, isn't our attempt to control it absurd? Instead of ignoring tragedy when the Romans took over the stage from the Greeks, they constructed enormous amphitheaters, packed them with thousands of people, and decided to turn up the volume. In ancient Rome, theatre was never only about art. It was also about performance, power, and public approval. The earliest Roman plays were translations of Greek plays, which were altered by playwrights such as Plautus and Livius Andronicus. They reduced the storylines, increased the physical gags, and Romanized the humor for a broader audience. The outcome? Fast-paced, boisterous theater that was fixated on erroneous identities, offensive jokes, and absurd characters who invariably ended up racing in circles. Roman comedy was refined by Plautus and his successor Terence, who created a genre of shrewd slaves, naive lovers, and troubled fathers, characters that would serve as models for Western humor for centuries to come. In addition to providing amusement, their plays parodied the ridiculousness, snobbery, avarice, social climbing, and hypocrisy of Roman society. Roman tragedy, however, was an entirely different animal. Roman tragedies, particularly those of Seneca, were emotional, violent, and occasionally plain unsettling, in contrast to the philosophical and poetic nature of Greek dramas. For instance, there is a scenario in Seneca's Thyestes where a man inadvertently consumes his own children. Seneca's impact would not be at its height until much later, so it wasn't exactly a night of light entertainment. Roman tragedy was not as popular in his own day as spectacle, which was the thing that really captured the public's attention. Romans cherished majesty, blood, and noise. Playwrights and producers physically stepped up the drama since gladiator bouts and chariot races were common ways for theatre to compete. It was lavishly staged. Water effects, cranes, and trapdoors were used in several productions. There was music everywhere, frequently overpowering the conversation. Similar to the Greeks, actors wore masks, but their performances relied more on dramatic gestures than on subtle emotional expression. In certain severe situations, the deaths on stage were actual executions interwoven into the narrative rather than staged deaths. That's your Rome. The theatre also evolved into a propaganda tool for rulers. It was employed by Nero and Augustus to advance imperial philosophy. In actuality, Nero considered himself an actor and made spectators endure his never-ending shows or face execution if they left. The stage served as a battlefield for fame, prominence and power in ancient Rome. Far more sensational than Greek theatre, but less sacred. The focus had shifted from catharsis to control. A distinct kind of theatre that was steeped in philosophy, spirituality, and exquisite beauty flourished in ancient India, far from the marble stages of Greece and the bustling arenas of Rome. Indian theatre originated in the silent depths of religious texts and oral tradition, rather than at wine festivities. The Natya Shastra, an old Sanskrit treatise on drama credited to the sage Bharata, and dating from between 200 BCE and 200 CE, serves as its basis. This was a cosmic blueprint rather than merely a performance manual. The book claims that theatre was made by the gods as a gift to humanity, a means of soul-lifting, education, and entertainment. Everything is described in the Natya Shastra, including stage design, character kinds, face expressions, gestures, music, and even the psychological repercussions of play. It highlights rasa, or the audience's awakened emotional essence. Every play sought to awaken the soul and lead it toward enlightenment, whether it was through the themes of Raudra, rage, Karuna, compassion, or Shringara, romantic love. The performances were intricate but well-structured. Actors undergo years of training in voice, movement, and mudras, standardized hand gestures that convey information without the need of words. The stories, which combined mythology, morality, and magic, were taken from epic classics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana, and dialogue was frequently sung or chanted. Kalidasa was one of the first playwrights known to exist, and his work, Shakuntala, is still regarded as a classic of literature. His creations were not just well-liked, but also highly regarded. It was anticipated that audiences would be spiritually and emotionally touched. They came for a sophisticated experience of being, not just a story. In India, theatre was inclusive in a very different way. Although performances were frequently sponsored by elite courts, folk traditions also thrived. Sanskrit theatre existed alongside regional village drama, puppet theatre, and dance drama styles like Kathakali and Yakshagana, each with its own rules, costumes, and musical rhythms. Unlike in Rome, where the goal was spectacle, or in Greece, where the aim was civic reflection, Indian theatre tried to harmonize, to balance passion, intellect, and spirit. It was art and dharma, prayer and performance. The actor was more than just a performer in this realm of silks, incense, and layered symbols. They were a spiritual conduit, fusing myth and reality and embodying the ageless tales that explained life and death. Theatre did not suddenly appear in ancient China. Rather, it developed over ages of dance, music, and ritual like a delicate fan. Shamans, court performers, and religious rituals that combined movement and meaning existed before there were actors and scripts. Chinese theatre has its origins in the Zhou period, more than 3,000 years ago, when nuo, or masked dances, were performed to fend off evil spirits. These were serious spiritual matters not to be laughed at. These customs changed over time, incorporating aspects of music, mime, and storytelling. A legitimate dramatic form that integrated philosophy, discipline, and aesthetics was emerging during the Tang dynasty, 7th to 10th centuries CE. The Pier Garden, the earliest known royal acting academy, was even founded by the Tang court under Emperor Xuanzong. Actors received training in gesture, acrobatics, dance, and voice. It is understandable why actors in traditional Chinese theatre are still referred to as Pier Garden children. However, Chinese drama really took off in the 13th and 14th centuries during the Yuan dynasty. Confucian control relaxed, and popular entertainment flourished throughout the Mongol era. Poetic drama, or zhazhu, gained popularity. It had comedic interludes, well-structured arias, and powerful female leads, sometimes performed by real women, which is uncommon in the history of world theatre. Here comes UN playwright Guan Hanqing, who is frequently likened to Shakespeare. His writings were brimming with lyrical beauty, social critique, and emotional depth, such as The Injustice to Duyi. With performances that relied on symbolic gesture, stylized movement, and sparse scenery, they conveyed tales of tragic heroines, moral quandaries, and unjust rulers. In addition to hearing the words, the audience was supposed to read the body. Chinese opera, a vibrant and rich culture that reached its full expression during the Ming and Qing dynasties, originated from these origins. The 18th century saw the crystallization of the most well-known genre, Jingju or Peking opera. It transformed performance into a ritualized visual language through the use of elaborate costumes, color-coded makeup, martial arts, and piercing falsetto voices. Every motion, like lifting a sleeve or cocking the head, had a deeper meaning. Although the stage was nearly empty, your mind conjured up images of mountains, palaces, and battlegrounds. Furthermore, Chinese opera sought essence rather than reality, in contrast to Western theatre. Chinese theatre conveyed values, preserved history, and portrayed a worldview in which people, heaven, and earth all danced in silent harmony in addition to telling stories. In Japan, theatre arose with quiet, nuance, and spiritual restraint rather than with clamour or extravagance. No is one of the oldest theatrical forms still in use today, and it is not like anything that has ever existed before or since. A whisper of drama in a society consumed by noise, No, which was born in the 14th century, was less of a show for the general public and more of a ritual for the cultivated spirit. Dengaku and sarugaku, folk dances, Buddhist chanting, and humorous sketches that delighted both laypeople and monks are the origins of No. However, a father-son team transformed everything in the 1300s. No was transformed into a disciplined, poetic, and highly symbolic art style by Kanami and his son Zeami. Zeami gave No its heart as a performer, author, and theorist. His writings established a theory of beauty based on yugen, which is a type of enigmatic elegance or profound nuance. Less wasn't simply more in No, it was crucial. Every performance combines poetry, dance, music, and drama into a seamless whole. Actors move carefully and slowly, and they frequently resemble statues rather than live performers. Dialogue is sung or chanted, accompanied by a small orchestra of flute and drums. The illusion of realism does not exist. Rather, it is a dreamy experience, more akin to hearing a ghost story from the ghost itself. And speaking of ghosts, many No plays are genuinely about spirits. Characters who appear frequently include wandering monks, insane ladies, dead warriors, and lost lovers. These are reflections on longing, loss, and remembrance, rather than action-packed tales. Usually wearing a carved wooden mask, the shite, or main actor, is frozen in an expression that changes slightly depending on the light or head angle. These masks are sacred items, not props. No's stage is simple, consisting of a painted pine tree backdrop and a plain wooden platform. This simplicity, however, is misleading. Every detail, from the shuffle of the actor's feet to the silk robes, is coordinated to convey the spiritual beneath the surface. Time seems to be slowing down. The ordinary vanishes. No became an aristocratic art form, supported and patronized by the samurai class. It was not intended for applauding spectators. It was for reflection, for connection to something timeless. Performances from 600 years ago are still substantially the same now. The theatre becomes the boundary between realms in number death or life, form and void, silence and voice. In many societies, a different kind of theatre flourished in the background, while opulent stages and aristocratic performers took centre stage. Theatre with puppets. Puppetry was more than just kids' entertainment, particularly in Asia. It served as a potent vehicle for memory, morality, and myth, where the inanimate whispered truths the living dared not say. Wayang kulit, or shadow puppetry, is an old art form that has become a hallowed institution in Indonesia, especially in Java and Bali. Thin, flat puppets made from buffalo skin were artistically carved and painted, then held behind a white screen with a flickering oil lamp. The outcome? Silhouettes dancing in fading light, summoning whole worlds out of darkness. The puppet master, or dalang, was at the center of it all. The dalang was much more than just a performer. He was also a philosopher, narrator, comedian, and spiritual advisor. He played dozens of characters from Hindu epics such as the Ramayana and Mahabharata with a single voice. A gamelan orchestra's rhythmic pulse may accompany the narrative for hours or even into the night. Wayang was more than just amusement. It was a ritual act commonly performed during temple festivals, births, funerals, or political rituals. Each puppet symbolized more than a character. It was a lesson, a karmic echo, a force. Meanwhile, in Japan, another captivating form arose: bunraku. Bunraku puppets, in contrast to Wayang's silhouettes, are big, realistic, and controlled by 3 puppeteers in front of the audience. The head and right arm are controlled by one, the left arm by another, and the legs by a third. Before a puppeteer can even touch the puppet's head, they must undergo years of training. The outcome? Eerily realistic. A puppet woman tugs her sleeve in sadness. A warrior trembles before death. It's captivating. However, one chanter sits next to a shamisen musician and delivers the narration. His voice turns into murmurs, wrath, tears, and thunder. The puppets move, but the soul comes from his throat. Because it was able to express things that humans couldn't, puppetry flourished. Puppets in strict societies explored forbidden love or vengeance without retaliation, ridiculed emperors, and questioned fate. After all, it wasn't a man accusing the king, it was just a doll. Puppet theatre transformed wood and string into mirrors, reflecting the deepest fears, dreams, and realities of the cultures who created them, whether in broad lantern light or in flickering shadows. Ancient theatre didn't just disappear, from the inebriated shouts of Dionysus to the hushed elegance of no masks. It reverberated, changing the way we tell stories to this day. Its legacy is present in every stage, film, and script. It is not merely preserved in dusty manuscripts or stone ruins. We had structure thanks to the Greeks. Modern storytelling is built on their innovations, dialogue, dramatic conflict, and character arcs. The play in 3 acts, that is, Aeschylus, the tragic hero from Sophocles who is undone by hubris, muttering through time. The Greeks even experimented with the idea of a 4th wall, that imperceptible partition separating performer and audience, century ago. Despite their passion for show, the Romans left behind a different legacy: theatre as a form of public amusement. Shakespeare's Globe and contemporary sports arenas were both modelled after their outdoor amphitheatres. Additionally, their comedies, which were rife with farce, misidentifications, and obscene misunderstandings, served as a precursor to slapstick and Western sitcoms. The influence of theatre is equally as great in the East. Rasa, an Indian drama that emphasizes emotional resonance and the harmony of aesthetic moods, has an impact on poetry, classical dance, and film in addition to performance. The Natya Shastra's intellectual influence is still seen in Indian storytelling today. Centuries of visual storytelling were influenced by Chinese opera's stylized emotion and color-coded meaning. Opera actors' rhythmic, choreographed combat has influenced martial arts films as well. In the meantime, No and Bunraku in Japan are still practiced and respected as living traditions. Their simplicity had an impact on Western experimental theatre as well as contemporary filmmakers like Kurosawa. What about the puppets? They've grown in number, The idea of animating the inanimate is still alluring, as shown in Southeast Asian shadow plays and TikTok digital avatars. Everything from children's television to cutting-edge performance art has been impacted by puppetry's capacity to condense emotion into simple gesture. However, this is arguably the greatest enduring remnant of ancient theatre. Humans must perform. To observe and be observed. To transform after slipping into someone else's skin. That same heritage is present in every ritual, meme, and monologue performed on a dark stage. A quest for meaning via speech, mask, and movement. Therefore, keep in mind that you are seeing a sacred echo in addition to enjoyment the next time you see a play, movie, or TikTok skit. Despite its evolution, theatre has remained our most honest and ancient mirror. Her bloodline was as keen as a sword, and Sinane was born into a world where bloodlines were everything. Philip II of Macedon, who transformed a divided country into a military powerhouse, was her father. Odoata, an Illyrian princess from a ferocious warrior tribe to the west, was her mother. The majority of Macedonian princesses were prepared for diplomacy with silk drapes and alliances. However, she was brought up for battle. Sinane was burdened by two strong legacies from the time she was able to walk. Her Illyrian mother's unwavering tenacity and her father's tactical genius. She was studying how to handle a spear, while other royal females were learning how to weave. Odoata did not simply put up with this, in contrast to the majority of Macedonian queens. Her daughter was trained by her herself. Women were allowed to fight alongside men in Illyrian culture. Being strong was expected, not just appreciated. Discipline was ingrained in Sinane's early years. Instead of studying embroidery patterns, she studied the maneuvers of armies, performed swordplay in the heat of the day, and rode horses across rough terrain. Sinane took in everything in the palace of Aegae, where her father planned conquests. She observed how generals showed deference to Philip, listened on the outside of war councils, and realized too early that authority wasn't granted. They had to take it. There were benefits to being Philip's daughter, but there were also risks. The focal point of Philip's universe would be her half-brother Alexander, who was born to Olympias. There was a lot of rivalry, distrust, and ambition in the court. Even at its height, Macedon was hardly a tranquil place. Exiles, murders, and changing allegiances. She grew up like this. Sinane, however, wasn't a spectator. She had developed presence even as a little child. She rode faster, spoke bolder, and trained harder. She was aware that Alexander would never be her name. But in the spaces between civilizations, she could still leave her mark. By the time she reached adolescence, she was not only respected but also feared. In addition to her royal ancestry, she defied the expectations of a royal woman. She was a blade rather than a pawn. Sinane was baptized in steel, reared on horseback, and birthed in a palace. She was destined to conquer a man's world, not to live in it. Being the half-sister of Alexander the Great meant living a life on the precipice of a dagger, yet being a princess in Macedonia meant being born into a game of strategy. Alexander and Sinane had different mothers, but they had the same father, Philip II. Olympias, his mother, was notoriously cruel and ambitious, as harsh as the mountain tribes from whence she descended. Hers, Odoata, was Illyrian royalty. Sinane knew as a child that she would never be the successor. Alexander, the philosopher's tutor and the golden boy with the lion's mane, had previously been given that appellation. The world will one day bow down to him. The generals feared him, and the court loved him. Sinane, however, did not bow down. Sinane blazed a quieter, more incisive trail, while Alexander developed into the legend we now know. She stayed in Macedon, studying the inner workings of empires while he rode into Persia. She witnessed how dynasties might be overthrown by a single word, and how alliances changed like sand dunes. She discovered that swordplay wasn't always used on the actual battlefield. It was battled in whispers at times. She was not, however, a cloistered noblewoman. Words spread about Sinane's reputation as a warrior. The halls of power reverberated with rumors of her military skill, her capacity for leadership, combat, and riding. She was just as dangerous as Alexander, even though she had not stormed towns or traveled deserts. She was silent, something he was never. The world didn't need to watch Sinane. She required their underestimation of her. However, blood was money in a kingdom that was fixated on legitimacy and ancestry, and Sinane had plenty of it. In addition to being Philip's daughter, she was also the king's sister, and her Illyrian ancestry linked her to another dynasty of warriors. She might bring kingdoms together or tear them apart. She did not directly challenge Alexander. They were not engaged in combat. However, she served as a continual reminder that women were not the only ones with authority. Threats came from her skill, her heritage, and her presence. They're quiet ones, but they're threats. And Sinane remained behind, waiting, researching, and watching the wheels of empire revolve, while Alexander marched east to seek immortality. Because everything cannot be permanently covered by even the greatest shadow. Being a character with quiet potential wasn't enough for Sinane. She became a legend by her deeds. Sinane discovered her own battlefield at home, while Alexander established his dominion overseas. She also did not lead from behind a curtain, in contrast to many regal women of her era. Like a Macedonian general, she led troops, battled on horseback, and rode in armor. Her most well-known moment occurred when she led a military expedition into her mother's homeland of Illyria. The march wasn't merely symbolic. Sinane coordinated strategy, led troops, and engaged in combat. A royal woman racing into battle was both frightening and amazing during a time when even noblemen tended to stay away from the front lines. It wasn't merely for show either. She won. That campaign was more than a demonstration of military prowess. It was a proclamation. A claim was being staked by Sinane. She was more than just an intelligent noblewoman. Bloodied yet unbroken, she was a skilled fighter who had proven herself in combat. The corridors of Macedonian diplomacy had not diluted her Illyrian blood. It was now sharper. Sinane accomplished something remarkable by winning that campaign. She established a zone of influence separate from the enormous shadow cast by her brother. While Alexander ruled in the east, Sinane was establishing her own empire in the west. Loyalty, respect, and a reputation independent of other people's names. However, a woman never feels at ease in a position of power, particularly if she does not request permission. The court whispered back in Macedon that Alexander did not intervene because he was too busy capturing Egypt and Persia. However, his absence left a vulnerable void, and Sinane was well aware of how dangerous that void might get. She wasn't merely a fighter for the sake of being one. She had a bigger plan than herself. Now that she was a mother, she planned to transfer her authority. Therefore, Sinane readied herself for the next move, while men shaped history in their own image. She had gained merit rather than birthright, tasted command, and soiled her armor in actual combat. She wasn't just a princess, she was just beginning her career as a commander. Despite all of her triumphs and her spirit of bravery, Sinane's most daring move included a daughter rather than a sword. She married Amyntas Forfa, a man of royal ancestry but limited political clout, and the two produced a child, Edea. Sinane used their union as a means of strengthening her ties to the royal family. Amyntas, however, died quickly and was probably killed by Philip II's incessant housekeeping, but Sinane made it through. Above all, she found potential in the ashes. She started Idea's upbringing as a potential queen rather than a submissive princess. The same fire that Sinain had been given as a girl was used to train Idea from the start. This child was not being prepared for a showy marriage. The young lady in question was being honed like a blade. Her schooling, speech, leadership, martial arts training, and, above all, politics were all directly overseen by Sinain. Legacy wasn't the only factor. Without Alexander, Sinain had watched the world fall apart. The generals were agitated, the court was split, and succession was unclear. There was no genuine heir for Alexander. Despite its size, his kingdom was brittle. He was a ticking time bomb when it came to the topic of who would reign after his death. Sinain had a strategy. Alexander's half-brother, Aridaeus, was regarded as the heir apparent despite his intellectual impairment, and her daughter would wed him. They would actually have power over the Macedonian crown if Idea married him and Sinain advised her. There was more to this than just ambition. It was a matter of survival. The empire was breaking apart. Generals and regents were hoarding power. Sinain realized she could not continue to influence the future without Idea. She wanted to shield Macedon from itself, not only place her daughter on the throne. However, ladies who made royal movements were not treated well in this world. Threats replaced whispers. The regents realized what was about to happen, especially Perdiccas, a former general of Alexander's. It was too risky for a warrior mother to raise a queen who had a claim to the throne. Ever brave, Sinain was ready to accompany Idea on the journey to make sure the marriage took place. She was prepared for opposition, but not for the treachery that would meet her along the way. Her daughter had been prepared for the throne by her. She would now have to pay for it. When Sinain left for Asia with her daughter, she was well prepared. This visit was not diplomatic. This was the kind of political ploy that may alter the course of an empire. King Aridaeus intended to marry Idea, a young yet noble woman. Sinain's bloodline would be directly linked to the throne through that union, giving her a front-row ticket to the regency of Alexander's disintegrating empire. The folks in charge, however, had a different perspective. Sinain was not a royal matron to Perdiccas, the ambitious general acting as regent. She posed a danger. A lady who has her own army, her own goals, and worse, the backing of the general population. She was admired by soldiers. She was revered among Macedonians. Her daughter had the support of one of the last genuine heirs, the charisma of a queen, and the blood of Philip. Perdiccas had no choice. Forces led by Perdiccas's own brother, Alcetus, intercepted Sinain and Idea as they crossed into Asia Minor. The decision was terrifyingly quick, and the moment was stressful. Unarmed but unfazed, Sinain refused to back down. According to other accounts, she insisted on seeing the king. Others claim that she made an immediate attempt to mobilize the soldiers against the regents. However, it was too late. They had already issued the order. The assassination of Sinain was probably carried out by Alcetus or at his direction, on the road, far away from justice and the court. She was stabbed for her ambition rather than her misdeeds, and she died by betrayal rather than combat. Even seasoned Macedonian veterans were astonished by what transpired next. According to reports, the soldiers who saw her killed rebelled. After all, Sinain was the daughter of Philip II, who was also a combat hero. It was blasphemy to kill a woman of her caliber, not merely a crime. The response was so strong that Perdiccas had to take a step back. In a startling turnaround, he finally let Idea to wed Aridaeus. However, the price had been high. Not because of adversaries, but because of its own concerns, Macedon had lost one of its most brilliant minds and most dangerous women. Although Sinain's armor was removed after she died, her plan endured. Now her daughter was queen. Her name would still appear on the following move, but it was no longer hers. The threat was intended to be eliminated by Sinani's death, but instead it sparked a fire. She did not stay Idea for long, since her daughter, who is now married to King Aridaeus, joined politics with the rage of a legacy broken. She made the bold decision to choose the name Eurydice, which is reminiscent of Argead dynasty rulers. It was a statement of legitimacy rather than merely a makeover. Instead of being a consort or a puppet, Queen Eurydice was now standing next to the king of Macedon as a partner in power. Eurydice swiftly emerged as the active voice of the throne, despite the fact that Aridaeus was mentally challenged and subject to strong regent supervision from Perdiccas and then Antipater. For a woman in Macedonian politics, she made a historic move. Wearing military garb and claiming the right to rule on behalf of herself and her husband, she started speaking directly to the soldiers. These gestures were not symbolic. With political instinct and military poise, Eurydice filled the void left by her mother. She won over the warriors, seasoned veterans who had accompanied Alexander throughout the known world, with her words. She pledged a restoration to Argead leadership, Macedonian power and order. The troops listened as her presence reminded them of Sinane. However, she rose at a perilous time. The brutal civil battles between Alexander's former generals, known as the Diadochi Wars, had already begun. Loyalty was shifting like sand, relationships were breaking out, and Macedon was disintegrating. In the center of it stood Eurydice, a young queen without her own army, opposing men in charge of legions. But she played bravely. She attempted to keep control of the capital and defied the recently appointed regent, Polyperchon. She rallied troops, wrote messages, and gave commands because she would not back down. She appeared to be unstoppable for a while. Like her mother, Eurydice's strength stemmed from her threat to males in positions of authority as well as her ancestry. Armored in pride, proficient in strategy, and unafraid to challenge the governing elite, she was truly Sinane's daughter. Like her mother's story, hers would be characterized by defiance rather than compliance. The opponents assembling around her would not put up with a queen who reigned like a king, even though she now wore the crown her mother had battled for. The storm that followed was as quick as Eurydice's ascent to power. Already in disarray due to Alexander's absence, the Macedonian Empire had devolved into a battleground between aging generals vying for dominance. The elderly general who had just been named regent, Polyperchon, was at the center of all of this mayhem. Young, aspirational, and worst of all, politically successful, Eurydice was an oddity in his eyes. She possessed the army, the bloodline, and the Sinane fire that fueled her. Eurydice initially attempted diplomacy. She issued royal ordinances in her own name and contested Polyperchon in writing. She stood in military garb before the soldiers, shouting out his authority. These were not empty gestures. For an instant, it appeared that she had the upper hand. Her mother was remembered by many in the army, and some were even eager to follow her. Polyperchon, however, was not alone himself. Alexander the Great's mother, Olympias, was a strong ally of his. Olympias returned to Macedon after years of exile with murder in her sights and revenge in her heart. There was more than just a personal rivalry between Eurydice and Olympias. Two dynastic visions clashed brutally in the end. Young, independent, and militant, Eurydice represented a new order. Olympias stood for the bloodline that had previously reigned without opposition, the old argued fire. Eurydice was betrayed after marching to face her adversaries. When confronted with the venerated Olympias and her more seasoned armies, her soldiers deserted her. They grabbed her and King Aridaeus. Once so near, the crown was torn off her head. Retaliation, not politics, was what followed. Eurydice was imprisoned by Olympias, who also made her kill herself. Like her mother, Sinane's daughter lost her life because she dared to assert her authority in a world dominated by men, not because she was in combat. Shortly later, her husband was killed. They weren't only put to death, they were blood-stained warnings delivered to any woman who may consider wearing crowns or commanding armies. However, Eurydice made an impression even after she died. Historians recall her narrative as a moment of defiance in a world that was becoming darker, and it became a legend, whispered among troops. She shared her mother's fate and had inherited her soul. Seldom are Synane and Eurydice mentioned alongside Olympias, Philip, or Alexander. In an empire fixated on masculine conquest, their names remain footnotes on the periphery of history. However, their brave, shrewd, and defiant lives paved a way through the harsh politics of their era. They were not just women of distinction. They were a rebellious dynasty. As Philip's daughter, Synane had been raised to fight well, but not to marry well. When most royal women were entering into marriage contracts, she had entered a battleground. In a world where strong women were not welcome, she had outlived her husband, outwitted her adversaries, and cultivated her daughter for power. In a time when even queens lacked agency, Synane led troops into battle and fought to win, not only for show. That passion was inherited by her daughter, and Eurydice took the torch and carried it to the throne after Synane was assassinated. Despite her brief reign, she left a lasting impression. Eurydice, clothed in full military regalia, stood before the gathered soldiers and spoke to them as commander. She wasn't a pawn. She had no intention of waiting for selection. They were hazardous because she made that decision by herself. Their killers weren't just protecting political power. They were standing up for a system, a society in which women might inspire allegiance without commanding armies. Unable to lead empires but able to have children, women could assert their authority without consent, as demonstrated by Synane and Eurydice. All they required was opportunity. The remarkable thing is how close they were to success. Synane might have led campaigns with Alexander in an other timeline where people were less fearful of their strength. After Alexander's empire fell, Eurydice might have restored Macedonian pride by stabilizing the throne. Rather, both were assassinated because they were too successful, not because they failed. They left behind bits of their legacy. They are mentioned in passing by Roman historians. The brief reign of Eurydice is hinted to by a few old coins. However, centuries of glory centered on men have buried the entire weight of their stories. The outline is still there, though. A daughter who ruled like a king and a mother who trained like a soldier. They were born into a conquest, and they left a conquest of their own, in their own terrible, ferocious manner. Although Eurydice and Synane were hushed, their tales were never fully forgotten. They linger like blood on a blade that history attempted to wipe clean, like distant thunder in the chronicles of empire. Their male relatives, Alexander's valiant campaigns, Philip's reforms, and Olympia's lethal guile eclipsed them for ages. However, if you pay close attention, you can follow their footprints through the damp ground. Synane, who successfully returned from leading troops into Illyria. Eurydice, who wore armor and confronted generals. Neither reigned for long, and neither passed away quietly. However, their bravery left a pattern for female power, resistance, and what a woman could be in an empire that was set out to destroy her. Their elimination is part of a pattern. The majority of ancient historians were men, and they documented events from a position of prestige and power. Synane and other women were not praised. They were dismissed as ambitious beyond their rank, denigrated, or dreaded. However, the pieces endure in succinct words, in sour deaths, and in the indignation of armies that saw their murders and shrank from the wrong. And there's still something amazing in those pieces: willpower. To assert authority, Neither woman required a crown. Through their deeds, leadership, and very presence, they personified it. Their strength was developed via public defiance, battle scars, and training grounds rather than being inherited. The notion that only males could influence the world was called into question by Sinene's very presence. Eurydice demonstrated that a woman could address warriors while dressed in royal garb without shuddering. Their names still cause controversy. If they had lived longer, what may have happened? Would Eurydice have been able to keep Macedon united? After Alexander's death, may Sinene have been the war commander Macedon needed? The prospect itself is a legacy, but we'll never know. By extracting their tales from the dust of long-forgotten scrolls, contemporary scholars are starting to rediscover them. They are the heroes of their own vicious, brilliant stories, not supporting characters. Despite their disruption of their reality, Sinene and Eurydice did not survive. And they echo for that. They serve as reminders of what power looks like when it doesn't ask for permission. Not as ghosts of empire. They had their crowns taken, their tales were nearly forgotten. Even if history attempted to bury the ashes, their fire continues to blaze. Martial arts originated in the void between survival and the sacred before there were belts, masters, or movie myths. Fighting was more than just a utilitarian need in early societies. It was ceremonial. It was how societies molded their souls, disciplined their bodies, and guarded their boundaries. It was not sports that gave rise to the first martial arts. They developed due to necessity. People were already practicing for weapons, grappling, and hitting long before they could write. However, basic survival evolved into something more complex over time. Combat evolved into a code, a discipline, and a route to self-mastery as well as physical mastery. Consider the hunters of antiquity. Their thrusts, lunges, and evasions served as the basis for martial arts routines. Every hunt served as a training ground for battle, and every conflict required a warrior who was more coordinated, intelligent, and strong. However, the movements persisted even after the weapons were put down. They were repeatedly performed until they developed into a ritual, a form of physical language that could be transmitted from one generation to the next. This pattern was duplicated all around the planet. More than 4,000-year-old carved seals from the Indus Valley depict people in poses that are strikingly similar to those found in contemporary martial arts. Tribal wrestling served as the foundation for coming-of-age rituals in Africa. Soldiers in Mesopotamia and Egypt developed their own fighting techniques, including as grappling grips and hand-to-hand attacks, in addition to training in regimented formations. They were literate in their physique. Combat was always associated with symbolism, and to battle was to speak the language of kings. Animals, spirits, or cosmic forces were imitated in movements. A strike was the personification of a myth, not merely a hit. A series of movements could be a prayer for protection or a representation of a conflict between gods. Martial arts training evolved into a ceremonial art that was included into religious ceremonies, festivals, and funerals. Warriors were revered for their form even in death. Weapons are thoughtfully positioned next to skeletons in ancient graves, serving as identity markers rather than practical instruments. The sword was an integral part of who you were, not just something you carried. Therefore, martial arts were not optional in these ancient worlds. Rather, they were necessary rituals that combined the mental, the physical, and the supernatural. It was about becoming, not about battling. Many people consider Kalaripayattu to be the oldest martial art in the world, and it originated in the misty, palm-covered hills of southern India. This system originated in the Kerala region and is approximately 3,000 years old, if not older. It sprang from a society where spirituality, medicine, and warfare were all closely related. Payattu means to battle or practice, and Kalari implies a training site. But fighting was never the only aspect of Kalaripayattu. It was a system where soldiers trained to master themselves as well as vanquish adversaries. It was a discipline of change. It blended deep breathing exercises, meditation, and stretches that predate modern yoga with strikes, grapples, and weaponry. Tradition holds that the sage Parashurama, a heavenly warrior who is said to have regained Kerala from the sea, influenced the art. He developed Kalaripayattu as a sacred way to strike a balance between strength and wisdom, not just as a fighting style. Before ever handling a weapon, students learned body control, flexibility, and agility during their early training. The Kalaris, or training fields, were revered places. There was a ritual to entering the Kalari. Pupils bowed before their master, the gods and the ground. Mepayattu, or the bodily conditioning patterns, kicked off the lessons. These were smooth, nearly dance-like movements designed to activate every joint, muscle, and tendon. The movements were inspired by the lion's aggression, the peacock's grace, and the snake's strikes. Later weapons included spears, daggers, curved swords, wooden sticks, and the fabled urumi, a flexible, whip-like blade so deadly that it took complete bodily control to handle it securely. But in addition to fighting, students studied Ayurvedic medicine, which taught them how to mend what they could harm. Philosophy was also always present. Kalaripayattu imparted lessons on patience, humility, and life-respect. Without control, victory amounted to defeat. Without empathy, power was anarchy. Kalaripayattu was repressed when foreign invaders, first the Portuguese, then the British, arrived. However, it never perished. It moved underground, spread through footwork and whispers, was concealed in dance, and pretended to be therapeutic. It is still alive today. As a living connection to one of humanity's first ideas of what it means to be a warrior and a sage, not just as a martial art. Kung Fu is the first word that most people associate with martial arts. However, Kung Fu, or Gong Fu, is more than just fighting in China. It denotes proficiency attained from hard work, whether in fighting, cooking, or calligraphy. The old martial traditions that have their roots in early China's temples, mountains, and battles are the best example of that spirit. Chinese martial arts have more than 4,000 years of history. Zhou dynasty military writings from antiquity detail weaponry, battlefield layouts, and hand-to-hand fighting exercises. However, in the quiet of the monasteries where philosophy and movement collided, the real essence of Kung Fu was revealed. The Shaolin Temple, a Buddhist retreat tucked away in the Song Mountains, is where the most well-known origin tale starts. According to legend, the meditation techniques that would eventually become Shaolin Kung Fu were brought by a monk named Bodhidharma, who traveled from India in the 5th century CE. He saw that the monks required physical fitness to balance their spirits because they were weak from sitting in meditation for extended periods of time. He therefore taught them forms, synchronized breathing, animal-like fluid motions, and awareness-boosting techniques. These styles evolved into intricate martial arts systems over ages, each with its own rhythm, ideology, and objective. Crane for elegance, snake for flow, and tiger for strength. Every movement served as a metaphor for an idea. Strike with inner stillness, protect with emptiness, and attack quickly. Shaolin monks were spiritual athletes as well as fighters. They held that you had to overcome yourself before you could perfect combat. This was about internal power, not physical strength. At its core was the concept of qi, or life energy. The movements were not arbitrary, rather they served as channels for qi circulation, yin and yang balance, and body cosmos alignment. Shaolin was not the only branch of Kung Fu. In the Wudang Mountains, Taoist monks created their own gentle flowing forms, like as Tai Chi, that focused on force redirection, harmony, and breathing. These styles demonstrated that martial force might come from yielding rather than clashing, by placing more emphasis on energy control than impact. Not only as combat training, but also as a living ideology, Kung Fu persisted through dynasty conflicts, cultural revolutions, and industrialization. It taught discipline, ethics, and how to fight without becoming angry and win without being cocky. Since the ultimate enemy in China was always in balance within, it was never merely an adversary. Under the scorching sun of Olympia and in the dust of ancient Greek arenas, there existed a combat technique so full and unadulterated that even experienced hoplites recoiled. Pancration, which means all powers or total strength, was the name given to it. And it was more than just a pastime. It was weaponless combat at the feet of the gods. When pancration made its debut at the Olympic Games in 648 BCE, it quickly rose to fame. This was full-contact combat at its most basic level, a combination of striking and wrestling. Participants struggled, choked, kicked, punched, and fractured bones. Just the two rules: don't bite. Avoid gouging your eyes. The rest was up for grabs. Pancration, however, was discipline rather than chaos. Instead of uncontrolled savagery, fighters were schooled in control and strategy. They researched the human body's mechanics, including when to lock a joint, crush the windpipe, and where to strike and pivot. In the palestra, where hand-to-hand tactics and gymnastic conditioning collided, they practiced non-stop. Pancratiasts were respected for their technique and mental toughness in addition to their strength. Furthermore, the art was not limited to the games. Greek troops prepared for combat by practicing pancration. It belonged to the warrior's arsenal. You fought with pancration if your sword fell, your shield cracked, and your spear shattered. Unforgiving, bare-handed, and at close quarters. Its heroes become the subject of legendary stories. One mentions Aristion of Phegalia, who locked his opponent in a last submission grip and passed away during a fight. Even though he was dead, his opponent gave up, and Aristion was declared the winner after his death. He came to exemplify Pancration's unwavering dedication, even to the point of death. However, pancration waned with time, much like many other ancient combat arts. The gladiatorial spectacle took over after Greece was overrun by Rome. Later, its practice virtually disappeared when new cultural orders emerged and the pagan society fell. However, its legacy endured because of the idea that the entire body may be used as a weapon, the harmony between aggression and control, and the foundation it left in contemporary combat sports like mixed martial arts. Pancration is regarded as one of the most comprehensive fighting techniques of antiquity by both historians and martial artists today. For the Greeks, being strong meant more than merely using force. When all else was lost, it was about conquering every aspect of who you were. Ancient Egypt conjures images of pyramids, pharaohs, and animal-headed gods. But beneath the Sphinx's shadow and Tutankhamun's golden mask lay a militaristic society where mastery of the arts was a route to prestige and respect rather than merely a tool for soldiers. The oldest written accounts of martial arts in Egypt are found in artwork. More than 400 representations of grappling techniques, throws, locks, and stances can be seen on the walls of tombs at Beni Hassan that date back to approximately 2000 BCE. These remarkably detailed photos demonstrate how highly skilled Egyptian warriors were at unarmed combat training. Wrestling was a national passion, not a hobby. Young aristocrats began learning martial arts at a young age. Combat was viewed as a preparation for the soul as much as a test of physical prowess. The soldier was a guardian of Mayat, the world's divine equilibrium, in addition to being a fighter. Training the body meant getting ready to protect that cosmic order. However, wrestling was only one aspect of Egypt's martial arts heritage. Stick fighting, which has a modern descendant called tatib, was taught to warriors. Often performed to drums, this graceful yet ferocious art featured rhythmic movements with a long staff. It began as a very martial dance performed by guards, soldiers, and royal bodyguards, but over the years it developed into a ceremonial dance. Archery, Spears, daggers, and battle axes were among the weapons that were practiced, but close fighting was as crucial. Egyptian fighters needed to be adaptable. For example, in chariot combat, an ancient mobile martial art that required steely nerves and unwavering attention, troops were trained to shoot with deadly accuracy while racing at full speed. The ability to fight was important even in myth. First and foremost, gods like as Horus, the falcon-headed guardian, were soldiers engaged in a never-ending struggle with chaos. By portraying their triumphs as manifestations of divine will, pharaohs modeled themselves after these divine warriors. Those who fought in war were not only men, they were tools of order, and war was sacrosanct. Even though Egypt's martial arts systems never made it into a formal lineage like Kalaripayattu or Shaolin Kung Fu, their spirit endures because they are ingrained in ritual, rhythm, and stone. Because fighting along the Nile meant protecting the universe itself, not simply winning. Japan's martial character was already taking shape on the storm-swept coasts and foggy valleys of its islands, long before the name samurai reverberated through songs and scrolls. Japanese martial arts have its roots in ancient ritual, clan conflict, and spiritual discipline rather than in contemporary karate dojos or sword-fighting duels. Warriors used bronze weapons, stone-tipped arrows, and simple, survival-oriented fighting skills throughout the early centuries, during the Yayoi and Kofun periods. Despite their lack of structure, these early forms placed a strong emphasis on productivity, teamwork, and natural movement. Fighting was intensely tribal and went beyond simple physical combat. Family and clan loyalty were paramount. To defend your lineage was to fight effectively, but martial culture started to solidify when Japan reached the Heian period, 794–1185. Archery on horseback took center stage. The perfect warrior was a scholar, an archer, and a horseman in addition to being a savage with a sword. The bushi, the early samurai prototype, emerged at this time. Their code combined personal honor with military prowess, and many Japanese martial arts evolved from this changing warrior class. Kyujutsu, or the art of the bow, was one of the first systems. The yumi, a tall, asymmetrical bow that required exceptional strength and control, was used by archers to practice shooting from horseback. This eventually developed into kyudo, or the way of the bow, which placed an emphasis on mindfulness, breath, and spiritual focus in addition to aim. Although swords were not yet the most used weapon, kenjutsu or sword technique also started to take shape. Far from the duels, the methods were straightforward, violent, and tried and true on the battlefield. Swords weren't symbols, they were implements. Nonetheless, a code of conduct was developing within these methods. This code developed into what is today known as Bushido, or the Way of the Warrior, by the Kamakura period. In addition to triumph, honor, loyalty, self-control, and inner serenity became crucial. Martial arts training evolved into a moral path as well as a means of preparing for conflict. Archery, swordsmanship, and subsequently hand-to-hand fighting techniques like jujutsu were all practiced as spiritual and physical disciplines. To fight in ancient Japan meant to walk a path of balance between technique and heart, body and spirit, life and death. Not alone was victory expected of the warrior, but a good death as well. Africa is much too frequently overlooked while discussing the origins of martial arts. However, throughout this enormous and varied continent, ancient tribes created strong, intricate and deeply ingrained martial traditions, systems influenced by ceremony, spirituality, and survival. These were symbols of identity, tradition, and holy obligation rather than merely means of fighting. The ancient combat sport of the Hausa people in West Africa, Dambe, is one of the most enduring African martial arts. Dambe, which is typically done by butchers and warrior guild members, blends strong low kicks with bare-knuckle boxing. In order to defend themselves, fighters keep one hand, known as the spear, open while wrapping the other in fabric or tough rope. Combat is transformed into celebration when matches are held during public events like harvest festivals. Don't be misled though, this is martial training that has been ritualized. Another long-standing custom, layam or Senegalese wrestling, is still practiced in Senegal. With origins in pre-Islamic times when it was a rite of passage for young men, layam is more than just a sport. It is a national art form. With the accompaniment of drums, dance and spiritual chants, wrestlers engage in intense wrestling. Marabouts, spiritual gurus who provide charms and blessings, are frequently consulted by fighters prior to battle. Victory requires more than just strength. One also needs spiritual favor. Nguni stick combat, a martial tradition in Zulu culture further south, has a rich history. This art, which uses a blocking stick and a striking stick in quick-fire exchanges, is practiced by young Zulu males as part of military training and initiation. Stick fighting helped boys develop their bravery, reflexes and warrior mentality in addition to preparing them for future warfare. It was claimed that even the fabled Shaka Zulu improved his skills by studying and adapting traditional stick fighting tactics into formations that changed the face of warfare in southern Africa. Historical records and paintings from Ethiopia show troops in close-knit formations with spears, shields, and short swords. These images are occasionally accompanied by wrestling customs that placed a strong emphasis on throws and body control, skills that are essential for both ritual and combat. Movement was meaning, combat was culture, and the distinction between fight and festival, struggle and belief was always blurred in African martial arts. And throughout the continent, the warrior was more than just a combatant. He was a performer, a guardian, and a living embodiment of the spirit of his people. The native populations of the Americas had already established intricate and rich martial traditions long before European ships ever set foot on the continents. These systems were actual, used, and firmly ingrained in culture, ritual, and survival, even though they weren't structured like schools or documented in manuals. Martial culture was essential to Aztec society. Boys were taken to Telpochcali, or youth training houses at a young age to learn discipline, warfare, and how to use weapons. Elite warriors were represented by the Makua Huitl, a wooden sword with obsidian blades inserted in it. It had a scary ease with which it could cut through flesh. However, Aztec combat techniques were linked to religion and went beyond simple skill. Fighting was a way to honor oneself in the afterlife, a way to capture prisoners for ritual sacrifice, and a sacred responsibility. The designations of the elite orders into which Aztec warriors were grouped, such as the Jaguar and Eagle warriors, were more than just titles, they were spiritual identities. In combat, one could become a living weapon driven by divine purpose and embody the spirit of the beast. The Inca Empire, located further south, had a strong martial culture of its own. The Incas taught troops intensively, but their engineering and empire-building skills are more well known. Their fighters trained in formations appropriate for mountain combat and employed bolas, clubs, spears, and slings with strategic accuracy. Young soldiers received training in endurance, strength, and state allegiance. Warfare was a test of cosmic balance and was ritualized in addition to being political. Numerous indigenous tribes in North America engaged in warrior ceremonies that were closely related to daily life. For instance, the Lakota, Apache, and Comanche all have long-standing warrior traditions that included close quarters, fighting, horsemanship, ambush tactics, and stealth. Hunting, scouting, and intertribal fighting were used to refine skills. However, humility was just as important as bravery. The ideal warrior was noble, disciplined, and committed to the tribe's well-being. Games and dances, ritualized forms of preparation that developed strength, reflexes, and unity, were frequently used to depict combat training. The war dance combined energy with strike, rhythm with preparation, and it was more than simply theatre, it was a powerful invocation. Martial arts were extensions of worldviews rather than independent methods throughout the Americas. Fighting meant serving not only the tribe but also the land, the ancestors, and the harmony of the universe. What started out as survival skills, hunting, defending, and killing, became far more complex. Martial arts developed into spiritual disciplines across the ancient world, influencing not only warriors but entire societies. Every culture, from Africa to the Americas, from China to India, created its own fighting system. But it's more than simply attacks, holds, and weapons that bind them together. That's how those motions turned into a ritual. Training fields become places of worship. Warriors came to represent the order of the cosmos. Combat itself evolved into a route toward self-mastery rather than devastation. Violence was not taught in these early martial arts for its own purpose. They imparted wisdom, self-control, and equilibrium. The warrior in Kalaripayattu is also a healer. The fight in Kung Fu is as much an internal as an exterior one. In Pankration, mental toughness is just as important as physical prowess. The lesson is universal, even in African tribal dances and American war games. Dominance is not true strength, discipline is. Conquest, colonization, and modernization caused many of these traditions to be suppressed, dispersed, or altered over time. Kalaripayattu was prohibited by the British. During periods of political unrest, Chinese martial arts were forced underground. In order to survive, African systems were disguised as rituals. Although Native American battle expertise was forcibly removed, none of it actually vanished. Oral storytelling, folk dancing, and communal rituals have all preserved fragments. Others made a comeback in contemporary martial arts, including MMA, capoeira, judo, karate, and more. Even though the shapes are new, the roots are old. These days, learning a new technique, bowing before a teacher, or stepping onto a mat is more than just learning how to fight. They are taking part in a tradition that dates back thousands of years, in which every movement is a whisper from the past and motion is memory. Even though the old masters are no longer with us and their conflicts are over, their ideas live on. They taught that the goal of martial arts is to repeatedly defeat oneself until one's ego, fear, and anger are gone, rather than to defeat others. What's left is silence, accuracy, and intent, because all martial arts ultimately tell the same tale, regardless of where they originated. The process by which a person learns to be strong, not merely with their fists, but also with their spirits.